All right, so we come to Proverbs chapter 10 today, and if you're there, you'll notice that the very first line in Proverbs 10 says, the Proverbs of Solomon, okay? And you might be thinking, I thought we were reading the Proverbs of Solomon this whole time. You were. When we come to this introduction, what this kind of is a little tip-off is that we're coming into a different section of our study in the Proverbs. You might almost think of it as another collection of the Proverbs of Solomon. And there is some distinctions, really, from chapter 10 all the way on up through like the first half of chapter 22. We think of this section of Proverbs as being what many of us kind of think of the Proverbs in general, and that is kind of like these one-liners. It's like one verse. It's like one verse is like its own proverb. Now, scholars do kind of go through this, and they don't always agree as to whether a specific proverb might be more than one verse, like maybe it's these two verses together. The original manuscripts don't ever really give us any indication that this is where this one proverb begins and ends. But for the most part, you're safe to look at each verse as kind of its own proverb. Unless it's a real obvious no-brainer that it's kind of like, no, this is these two verses together. But what does happen, even as you're looking through this as each verse being its own freestanding proverb, a little nugget of wisdom, is that oftentimes the next verse will be on the same theme, kind of the same topic. And so what happens is these freestanding proverbs get kind of lumped together in the same section, which is why sometimes, and we'll see this today as we go through, we'll see like a few verses and they're kind of like, oh, it's along a theme. We'll identify that theme when it's really obvious. The other thing is we move on into this portion of the Proverbs. I just have to tell you that while we will read each and every one of these proverbs, I'm not going to expound on every one of these proverbs. And I'm only doing that for your sake. I would be perfectly content to expound on every word of every proverb, but you all know that most of us would go home to be with the Lord before we finish the Old Testament if we did that. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go through this, and as I shared with First Service, I'm going to try to strike a little bit of a balance. I think in First Service, honestly, I probably expounded on every proverb except for maybe 4 of them. And so maybe I'll not expound on 5 of them for you guys. I don't know. We'll see what happens as we go through this. But some of them are just kind of like they're no-brainers, or more specifically, it hits on a theme that we've already expounded on in other Proverbs, because there is a great deal of repetition in the wisdom that is set before us. And so some of them we'll just read through, some of them we'll just kind of quickly summarize, and some of them we'll camp out because it's just a really great, important truth that's worth spending time on. So we're here, Proverbs 10, verse 1, the Proverbs of Solomon. And it says in verse 1, a wise son makes a glad father, but a foolish son is the grief of his mother. I'm not going to try to explain what the difference is. Why is the dad proud and why is the mother grieved? Okay, you could spend time kind of working through your own ideas on that. But what we're going to see as we go through the Proverbs is that oftentimes there's a lot of contrasts that are set before us. Sometimes the contrast itself will help explain really what the second half might mean by the first. And other times we just kind of see this poetic picture laid out, meaning that a wise son, as much as that makes a father glad, well, it makes his mom glad too, okay? And it's not just that a foolish son is the grief of his mother. You know what? Dads are grieved by having foolish sons as well. David Guzik said of this verse, he says, wisdom benefits more than the individual, and folly grieves more than the individual. Okay? Meaning that when we are wise in our pursuits, in our decisions, that wisdom not only benefits us personally, but it oftentimes benefits a variety of other people around us. In verse 1, it's the parents. They're like, phew, I have a wise son. Like there's a blessing for that. But we also see that when we abandon wisdom or when we lack wisdom and we're operating in foolishness or folly, that the consequences of our foolishness also spills over into the lives of the people around us. And that's exactly how sin works. Sin is never something that is just isolated to the life of the person committing the sin. Sin will always, every single sin is an offense to God, okay? There's no way around that. And so your sin will always impact God. It will impact your relationship with God. But the majority of our sin also overflows and impacts human relations as well. Even if it's people that we've never met and never will meet, our sin oftentimes has an impact. It ripples beyond just us individually. When we move on into verses 2 and 3, it says, treasures of wickedness profit nothing, but righteousness delivers from death. As we move on into the next few verses, we're going to kind of see this theme of labor, like your physical labor, like the work that you do, as well as provision. And so when it says there that treasures of wickedness profit nothing, but righteousness delivers from death, and then the next one it says the Lord will not allow the righteous soul to famish, but he casts away the desire of the wicked. The treasures of wickedness, also that phrase gets translated as ill-gotten gain, and that's something we have already looked at in our study of the Proverbs, and that's when an individual is pursuing wealth at the expense of integrity. So wealth is the goal. I'm pursuing monetary gain, but I'm not so concerned with how I get that so long as I get that. And that pursuit of realizing, it doesn't matter who I step on or what compromises need to be made, so long as I am achieving what I want to achieve, that is the ill-gotten gain. That is the treasures of wickedness. And here the wisdom says, or the Word of God says, that those treasures of wickedness, they profit nothing. Now you might say, well, I don't know about that. Like there's this one year where I kind of didn't handle my taxes quite right, and actually it profited me about $5,000. Okay? The context here is that in the long term, there is no lasting profitability when we have compromised our integrity. And integrity will be another theme that will come up. I think that it runs throughout the Proverbs, but we'll kind of hone in on that on one specific proverb later on in our study today. But it's just talking about that ill-gotten gain. It has no lasting value, but living a righteous life does have the value of God protecting and providing for you. And so you get to live in just that, in the security of the Lord's provision for you. In Matthew 16:26, Jesus says, "For what profit is it to a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul?" And Jesus is just dealing with that very issue. It's that misprioritized pursuit where wealth is the thing that I'm aiming for at all cost. And you might say, well, I am looking for wealth and to make some money to get further ahead, but not necessarily at all costs. And I think that it's a very rare scenario where a person really thinks at all cost. But it's not a very rare scenario where an individual says that I will pursue wealth at the cost of my integrity. Meaning that if it's just a subtle lie, if it's just something that doesn't really seemingly hurt anyone else, then that's okay. And so we begin to see those compromises happening there. And Jesus, of course, is saying, well, what good is that? I mean, if you're going to sacrifice your own soul for the sake of temporal, the pursuit of the temporal, he says, then you've obtained nothing. In verses 4 and 5, it says, "He who has a slack hand becomes poor, but the hand of the diligent makes rich. He who gathers in summer is a wise son, and he who sleeps in harvest is a son who causes shame." And so verse 5 kind of piggybacks off of verse 1 about the foolish son versus the wise son. But it also brings in that work ethic that we saw back in chapter 6 when the proverb spoke of, go to the ant, you sluggard. It was the idea that the lazy person would do well to learn a few lessons from the ant, who not only labors hard and consistently, but knows that there is a time to labor. That the ant labors, during the summer seasons, it labors during the harvest time, but it understands that once winter comes, your opportunity to labor and make an income has disappeared. And that there are opportunities. And so a wise individual will know not only how to work and know the necessity of working, but they will also know when to work. I would tag on to that, they also know when not to work. Because sometimes we do fall into, and this is nothing new or exclusive to our society, but we do have this thing called workaholics, who they work and they work and they work, but they never know when to stop working. And so the wise individual will know when to work, and they'll also know when not to work. That's not Solomon's emphasis here. His is simply that being a good, diligent worker, it pays off. And so in verse 4, when he says, "He who has a slack hand," or that's someone who is lazy, that the lazy person becomes poor. But the hand of the diligent makes rich. And we're not talking about like the hand of the diligent becomes like a billionaire. We're just talking about how the diligent worker is the person who produces wealth for themselves. And that wealth for themselves is a wealth that also will benefit a variety of other people. And so the producing of wealth is the result of diligence. We live in kind of an interesting time in at least the history of our nation and our society. It's not entirely historically new, but we do live in a time where there is a great deal of an entitlement perspective, and that is that someone else should be And you can fill in the blank, but it's doing or providing for me. And we see it at a variety of different levels. And in fact, most likely, some of us in this room are guilty both of having the perspective that someone else should be providing for me, and some of us in this room are also guilty of perhaps providing too much for other people, specifically our kids. And I've kind of harped on this from the pulpit in the past, but I won't hesitate to do it again. But there is a time where your kids do need to grow up and be responsible, because there is a time when you won't be here to do it for them. Okay? And so they need to learn to wipe their own bottom, and they need to learn to pay their own cell phone. They need to learn to put gas in their own gas tank, okay? They need to learn to get their own job. They need to learn to provide for themselves. There's a time and a season for each one of these things, okay? Hopefully your kids, if they're not like little guys, they've learned to wipe their bottom by now. You probably taught them how to do that one, hopefully, right? But there are a variety of parents who taught their kids how to wipe their bottom, but they haven't taught them how to maintain a job, hold a job, or provide for themselves. And again, I just say this because I know couples, married couples, whose parents are still paying their cell phone bills and still paying their auto insurance. And it's kind of like, you're supposed to be out on your own at a certain point. You know, there are difficult times, and yes, we want to help people through those difficult times. But a good parent will equip their kids to live a good, successful life. Proverbs verse 4 here says that he who has a lazy hand, the outcome of that is inevitable. It will be what? It's going to be poverty. That you have to labor in order to produce something. Both of these scenarios produce something. The lazy hand produces something. And here in the Proverbs, the lazy hand produces poverty. Okay? The diligent hand, on the other hand, diligence, it produces wealth. And we're not talking about billions of dollars or millions of dollars. We're just talking about provision. That when you labor, you earn that income. There is the provision that comes with that. In Colossians chapter 3, verse 23, Paul is writing to the church in Colossae, and he starts off by he's addressing wives, and he's giving them some specific instructions for their specific role as a wife. And then he moves on, and he does the same thing for husbands, and then he goes on, and he does the same thing for bondservants. That would be slaves who have an earthly master, and whether they have a good master or a bad, evil master who's harsh with them, he concludes this whole section the same way in verse 23 of Colossians 3. And what Solomon is identifying here is that poverty is a cruel master. And it can be the undoing of an individual. Oftentimes it is